foxes. Pretty cute, right? Fennec foxes are obviously a mammal. They live in North Africa and the Middle East, really. And if you look at them, obviously some characteristics stand out. So just in general, why do fennec foxes look like this? Why do any organisms look like they do? Because they've adapted to certain conditions. Through evolution, species have become well adapted to conditions around them. So when you look at the fennec fox, what are some characteristics that stand out? Grady?
The ears.
Yeah, obviously the ears, probably the most striking characteristic of the fennec fox. Anything else? Deep?
Their fur color.
Their fur, what about it?
It's like sandy.
What's that?
It's like sandy.
Sandy color, it's light. Anything else, Caitlin?
They're pretty small.
What?
They're pretty small.
They're pretty small, they are. Okay. So when we look at any organism, whether it's a fox or a plant or a mushroom or bacteria or protists, the characteristics of those organisms have evolved over time through natural selection. So when we look at an organism, we can start to think about, okay, well, why do the fennec fox have these characteristics? What is the value of these characteristics? Let's think about the ears, the most striking feature. What's the value of having ears that look like that? Dean?
You could probably hear.
What's that?
You could probably hear really well.
Hearing? You know, what's the function of external, like cartilaginous ears like we have? What do they do? Why do we have these things attached to the side of our head? Why don't we just have like a hole there? Any ideas? If you were to cut off your cartilage of your ears, okay, you just had a hole in the side of your head, how do you think things would be different? Okay? What's that? Okay, good. Yeah, like ears, like we have, and like many animals, one thing that they help to do is help us to determine the direction of sounds. Like because of the shape of our ears, we sort of hear sounds that are coming from in front of us differently than we hear sounds coming from behind or from the sides. So ears can be helped in determining the location of the sound. Yeah, sound and hearing is sort of an obvious adaptation for ears like this. Can anyone think of other reasons for the evolution of these really large ears? Right? Okay, how? How do ears cool down? That's all you got? What makes you say that though? Why?
Elephants.
What?
Elephants have the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why might they have to cool down? Grace?
Like rabbits have really big ears because like they have a lot of fur and sometimes it's hard like when it's hot out for them to like release like their heat. So when the blood goes off the ears it cools down and then it goes back to the mouth.
Okay. Interesting. All right. I'm not gonna tell you exactly right now. It's something to keep in your mind as we talk about evolution, as we talk about. All right. So let's talk just to summarize here the basics as we start talking about evidence. Evolution is scientific theory that over time the genes of a population can change. Now, often we might say as a definition, evolution is a change in a species over time. But really, what is changing? If the features of a species change, that's due to a change in what? What controls the characteristics of living organisms? Somebody? Me? Their genes, their DNA. Our DNA determines our characteristics. So when we talk about the evolution of a population, we're talking about a change in the genes, or the gene frequency in that population. So, a key thing to keep in mind, because people get confused. An individual organism, one living thing, does not evolve, does not adapt over time. Individuals are born with certain characteristics, with certain genes and DNA, and they retain those pretty much throughout their lifetime. They can't adapt to new conditions. It is a population, a group of organisms that can change over a period of time. So evolution is a scientific theory, and we talked earlier in the year about what that means in science. A theory is an explanation that's been well substantiated, that's been confirmed many, many times through experimentation, through observation, and evolution has reached the level of a theory in science, which means it is accepted through repeated experimentation and confirmation. What is this? What are these illustrations showing you? Right? Yeah, evolution of a whale. As we said earlier with whales and manatees, marine mammals evolved from terrestrial mammals, from wolf-like ancestors. Okay? Obviously, they went through many stages in that evolution, but that is what we know today, how they evolved over time. So it wasn't Darwin that started thinking about evolution. Humans have always thought about species changing over time. We can trace it back in history to the ancient world, to ancient Greece and China and ancient Rome. The ancient Greeks, some proposed that species change over time, okay? And that one species can change into another species. So that thinking has been around for thousands of years. Aristotle, he proposed this concept. Greek philosopher, who I'm sure you've heard of, right? You're all in Global. Or no, I guess not all of them. We'll learn about Aristotle. Did you guys learn that in Global? Yeah. So Aristotle, very influential philosopher whose ideas sort of were adhered to or valued for a long, long period of time into the Renaissance. He proposed this idea of a great chain of being that showed this hierarchy of organisms, with humans on top and then other organisms sort of ranked below them. In China, Taoism stated that species are not fixed and unchanging, but that they do change over time. Ancient Rome, Lucretius described the development of the earth not based on supernatural explanations, not based on divine intervention, but based on mechanistic, scientific principles that change the earth over a period of time. So these are all sort of the beginnings or thinking about evolution. In the Middle Ages, as Christianity took hold, most people believed that the species we see around us today, the species that are on earth, were all created by God, and they were fixed. They were created this way that we see them today. They've always been this way, and they would never change. Okay? That was called special creation. Okay? The thinking was that God would never create imperfection, and these species would never have to change over time. Okay? So God creates everything perfectly, and so that's the way the species are. Organisms were placed into this sort of hierarchy, this great chain of being that was started by Aristotle. However, in other areas, Islamic philosophers discuss sort of evolutionary types of ideas in their writings. As we reach the Renaissance and Enlightenment, this is when ideas really started to change. So again, at this time, most people believed in special creation, that species were unchanging in their current forms. And many people try to determine the age of the earth. How old is the earth? And the main source that they used at this time was the Bible. And by tracing back sort of passages from the Bible, they tried to work out exactly how old the earth was and came up with this idea that the earth was about 6,000 years old. That's what most people thought at the time. So 6,000 years is, yeah, it's a long time, but it's not a super long time. And so one important factor that went into people starting to think, well, species could have evolved into their modern forms was saying how old the earth was. And there's some geologists that started to push that idea that the earth is much, much older than this 6,000 years. But there were people at this time, philosophers and naturalists, that did propose that species were not set in stone, that were not fixed. One is a French naturalist, Buffon, and he had some ideas that he put forth that modern forms of organisms had evolved from previous forms. He proposed that lions, tigers, and cats shared a common ancestor. He also proposed that the earth is much older than people thought at the time. Again, these are all things that we know today are true, but it took some more work for this idea to really take hold in society. So it was the 19th century really where these ideas kind of blossomed, okay, during the Enlightenment and beyond. So one important one was advances in geology. So Hutton and Lyell proposed that, first of all, the earth is much, much older than people had believed. And that the earth itself, the position of continents, the building of mountains, the destruction of mountains, the carving of valleys, as you guys learned last year in earth science, that all of those processes happen through natural means, through erosion, through weathering, through the movement of continents. And also, humans had always discovered fossils, okay, all the way back in prehistoric times even, and sometimes didn't know quite how to interpret those fossils. You find fossils of a dinosaur. People knew that creatures like this don't exist today, okay? And so they had to interpret those things. One important scientist who really put forth some ideas about evolution was Lamarck. This is Lamarck. And Lamarck said that species adapt to their environment. So again, now we're getting closer and closer to what Darwin proposed. But his mechanism was off. Lamarck thought that species evolve by using certain parts of their body, increases their size, or increases their effectiveness, and then those changes can be passed on to the next generation. It's called the concept of use and disuse. For example, Lamarck said that giraffes had evolved these long necks because they were constantly reaching up into the trees, using their neck muscles, and then they became stronger, their necks stretched out, and they passed that on to their next generation, which again reached high into the trees and reached for food, increasing their neck length. And that process of using their neck muscles more and more is the reason why giraffes evolved to have long necks. Now we know today that's not how it works. Even if giraffes could stretch their necks, when they reproduce, that new stretching is not part of their genetic makeup, so it wouldn't be passed on to their offspring. Okay? This is what Lamarck believed was the inheritance of acquired traits, that things that happened during one organism's lifetime could be passed down. An important, I think, an economist at the time, I think Thomas was his first name, Malthus, in 1798, wrote a book that both Darwin and Wallace read, which got them thinking about natural populations. Malthus was writing about human population growth, and that population growth often outstrips the resources available. He noted that in nature, more organisms are produced than can possibly survive. There's an overproduction. And Darwin and Wallace started thinking about, okay, well, there's this overproduction of organisms in nature. well, which ones survive? Which ones can make it? And that led them to thinking about variations and how those variations come into play in terms of evolution. Then we get to Darwin and Wallace. So 1858 was when Darwin and Wallace, Russell Wallace, I don't know why they use his first name there, proposed their idea of common descent through natural selection. They both independently came up with the same basic idea. They both came up with these ideas based on very similar evidence, by observing species, by collecting species, and traveling around the world and seeing how the distribution of these organisms, similarities in these organisms, and so forth. Darwin came up with the ideas first. That's why he's more famous. He wrote on the origin of the species, okay, 1858, 59. And he was English. He was a naturalist, as you saw in the video yesterday. He traveled on the Beagle around the world. They spent most of their time in South America, bounced around though to Australia and New Zealand, back to South America again, until eventually returning back to England. He collected huge amounts of fossils and insects and organisms that he brought back to England, that he studied. And all of that led him to develop his ideas about natural selection. Origin of the Species is the name of the book. It became very popular at the time. It was controversial because it did sort of contradict much of religious thinking at the time. But scientists read it widely and it quickly took hold. His evidence that he provided was so extensive and it made such sense that it was widely adopted. And so in The Origin of the Species, Darwin describes his concept of natural selection as a mechanism, how species change over a period of time. It explains how that can actually happen through natural means. So we kind of look at this history on a timeline. So you know, think about the United States, Revolution, the French Revolution, the Civil War. This was the time when a lot of the scientific research was being done, being published. So when science, you know, the 1700s, 1800s, when science really started to become a discipline, people started doing careful scientific work, sharing those ideas widely. So some of the first scientists to do that were Carl Linnaeus, who you might remember from 7th grade, studied classification. Hutton was a scientist, a geologist, studying the Earth and these geologic processes that can change the Earth. Lamarck proposed the idea that species can change. Malthus talked about population limits. Okay? We have scientists studying fossils and geology and so forth. And then we have Darwin and Wallace, which developed their concept of natural selection. Okay? It was soon afterwards. You guys remember Mendel? In 7th grade, Gregor Mendel. What did he study? Genetics. He was the first to sort of give us our main initial principles of genetics by studying pea plants. He started his work a little bit after Darwin, so it was 1865 when Mendel published his papers about genetics. Actually, most people never read it. It was rediscovered many years later. But that's sort of to put this in a little bit of a historical context. So let's talk a little bit about the evidence. So what was this evidence that Darwin and others after him put forward that showed people that species do change over time, that they evolve through natural selection? Well, one of the initial and clearest indications was the fossil record. The fossils we know are the remains or imprints of species that have been preserved in rock and mineral. And when we look at the fossil record, what we see is that 99% of species that have existed are extinct. The species we see and we have around us today are only about 1% of the species that have ever lived on Earth. Lyle and Hutton helped us start to understand the Earth is much older than the 6,000 years most people had believed. We know today, through radioactive dating of rocks and minerals, the Earth is actually 4.6 billion years old. That is an almost unimaginably long period of time. And what that means is there has been enough time in the history of the Earth to allow for the evolution of the wide diversity of organisms we see today. Another important piece of the fossil record were transitional fossils. Transitional fossils are fossils that kind of show us the steps along the way of how species have changed. One example you can think about is these are horses. So when we find the fossils of horse-like creatures 60 million years old, we find that they were small little sort of dog-sized creatures. And they had 4 toes on each paw. We know today, obviously, modern horses are much larger. They have no toes, they have hooves instead. But scientists along the way have found the kind of in-between steps in the evolution of horses that show us the gradual reduction in the number of toes over the last 60 million years, and changes in size of horses along with lots of other changes. And we can see those in between steps. So that gives us good evidence that modern horses had evolved from previous species, and we can see the steps along the way. This is Archaeopteryx, an ancient fossil showing a transition between reptiles and birds. It had bird-like characteristics as well as reptile-like characteristics. We see fossils of species that are extinct, like trilobites. We can see the imprints from dinosaurs that ran across the mud millions of years ago. They've been preserved through these minerals. So all of this information helps us understand that species have changed over time. All right, we'll talk about the rest of the evidence in class tomorrow.